Bibles to the 11th chapter of Hebrews. We're going to be in probably the most well-known chapter in the book, chapter 11. And as we do so, I want to ask the question, how many roads are there to heaven? Is there more than one? Are there many roads that take us to heaven? Someone quipped one time that there are many roads to heaven, but only one gets you through the door. And I would suggest to you that there are actually two roads that not only get you to the gates, but get you in onto the golden streets as well. There are two ways to get to heaven, and we can choose which one we want. First one, of course, is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. If you place your faith in Jesus Christ, then you get to go to heaven based upon His righteousness. The other option is to just be perfect in all your ways, in all your thoughts and deeds and actions. Everything you say has got to be perfect. And if you can live a perfect life, which only one person has, then you too can go to heaven. And it's our choice as to which one of those two paths we want to go on. As I was a young believer, as Sherry was a young believer, my wife, we would be driving around sometime, and she would notice how the light turned green right before we got there, and she would say, "Oh, thank you, Lord, for giving us that green light." Or pull into a shopping center, and we'd get a spot right up near the front door, and she'd just, "Oh, thank you, Jesus." And I said, "You know what? The reason why that slot opened up is because somebody right before you left. You know, I mean, the reason why that light turned green is because they're on a sequence of timing, and every so often they turn green. That's just kind of the nature of things." And she would look at me and say, "Well, you just got to have faith." And I quizzically looked back at her and said, "What is that? What is faith? Where do you get some? Can I go? Is there a faith store someplace where I can go buy some?" Hebrews chapter 11 is what has been termed the Hall of Faith of the Bible. And let's go ahead and turn, if you would, in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. You can follow along with me. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made by the things that are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, testifying of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death. And quoting from Genesis, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is the rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to the place where he would receive an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him with that same promise. For he waited for the city who has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. And she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is on the seashore. All these died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country with which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. And by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. In life, we face many storms. And the ability to be able to weather those storms as they come in all different shapes and sizes, the ability for us to be able to take on the storms that come in life. We, as my wife used to say to me, you got to have faith. It was a dark and stormy night when out of the darkness came the voice from the little boy's room. Mommy, can I sleep in your bed? No, dear, she replied. There's not room with your daddy in here. Well, then the little boy said, will you sleep with me? No, honey, I have to sleep with your daddy. Well, there was a long silence, and it was broken by that same shaky little voice which said, Daddy's a big sissy. Faith is what gets us through the storms. And this is the subject matter. This is the idea behind Hebrews chapter 11. And it starts off, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Sometimes this is called the definition of faith. I can remember when I would ask my wife all these questions, and she would respond with, you just got to have faith. And then I would say, well, what is it? Where do you get it? Where do you buy some? And one day she stumbled across Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, and she brought it to me, and she said, here, read this. And so I did. I read it, and I said, so faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. That's really nice, but what does that mean? And she didn't know what to say. It's not so much a definition, though, as many people say, as it is a description of what faith is. It says it's the substance of things hoped for. The word substance in the New Testament is the word hypostasis, which is the opposite of hypothetical. We know what hypothetical is. And this is, hypostasis is a scientific term. It's something that you would see in science. It means something that's concrete. He says it's the substance of things hoped for. And the word substance, it also occurs, we saw it earlier back in chapter 1, verse 3, where it says that who being in the brightness of his glory and the expressed image of his person. That's the word hypostasis. It's also translated confidence in 3 or 4 other places in the New Testament. So where hypothetical is an educated guess, hypostasis is a concrete fact. It just means something that you can bank on, something that you can count on. And it says faith is the very concrete fact. It's the very substance of things that we hope for and the evidence of things that we don't see. Evidence of things literally in the New Testament means the practice of proof. It too also is a legal term. This would be something that would be given in a court of law when they would bring forth people's exhibit, whatever it would be. And this is the evidence of whatever the course was about. The new NLT, I think, does a pretty good job of translating verse 1, where it says, faith shows the reality of all we hope for, and it's the evidence of the things that we cannot see. I think one of the things that is difficult in understanding what faith is because we misunderstand the word so often. Sometimes, let's look at some things that faith isn't. For example, faith is not the ketchup on the hamburger of good works. And as trivial as that may sound, I think so many of us approach it that way. You know, we think that we just got to go out and do good deeds, and we got to have more good deeds than we have bad deeds, and we got to be a good person, as we examined a few weeks ago in our Hebrew study, and that faith is just like the condiment to those good works. It just kind of enhances it a little bit. It just gives it a little bit more savor. Faith is not the ketchup on the burger of good works, nor is it something that we reach down and conjure up. You know, if we say the right words and we pray on the right knee and we do things all the right way, that all of a sudden some sort of power is released and then things happen. That's not what faith is. Nor is it the little engine who could. You know, it's not the I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, and that's not what faith is. As we saw a couple of weeks ago, that'll always leave you lacking as well. You know, one could argue that one of the smartest dudes of the 20th century, a guy by the name of Malcolm Muggeridge, he says this about faith. He says, faith is a form of knowledge that transcends the intellect. I think one of the problems that we have with understanding faith is that we try to wrap our brain around it. And not that it's unreasonable, not that it's illogical, but it's one of those things that we can't grasp with our human intellect. It's something that transcends the human intellect, like Muggeridge says. Now, if you've gone to Calvary Chapel more than 10 minutes, you've probably heard many times how the word trust and the word faith are synonymous. That anytime you see the word trust in the New Testament, you can transpose it with the word faith. Anytime you see the word faith, you can transpose it with the word trust. I don't know if that helps you out, but trust is something that has a little more definement to it. I can understand the idea of trust more than I can faith. Faith is just a little too ethereal for me. But if we look at the verse once again, it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, and we think of it, now trust is the substance of things hoped for. To me, that's a little more concrete. I can wrap my brain around that just a little more easily. For by it, he says in verse 2, the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Okay, time for your 9th grade physics lesson. Atoms are made up of neutrons, protons, and electrons. Okay? We probably all remember studying the atom back in school. Now, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. A meter is about yay long. And if you cut that into 1 billion pieces, that's a nanometer. The average atom is 1/10th of a nanometer. Or in other words, we could say it is 1/10,000,000,000th of a meter. That's the average size of the average atom. That's pretty small. That's pretty teeny tiny. That's the things that are not visible. The things that are visible are made up of things that are not visible. What the author of the Hebrews is telling us is that all of this universe, everything in this whole universe is made up of these 1/10th of a nanometer atoms from one end to the other. It's kind of interesting considering the subject that atoms even exist wasn't settled until the 19th century. Until they started getting some reputable microscopes that they could look at things that small, and there was some dispute among scientists as to whether they even exist. I don't know about you, but I don't have enough faith to believe that all that stuff just happened naturally. I don't have it. It takes too much faith for me to think that we look at the entire size of this universe and it just came about, it just happened by natural causes. One of the leading evolutionists of the previous generation was Carl Sagan. And he liked to whimsically state sometimes that all matter was called star stuff, and that it began as some sort of primordial ooze that exploded into stars and planets and novas and black holes and dogs and cats and amoebas and stuff like that, people too. I think it's far easier for me to understand that God said, this all-powerful God said, star stuff be. And there was star stuff. And that's what Hebrews chapter 3 is, or 11:3 is telling us. Now, in light of what we understand from verse 3, let's go back to verse 1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Let's go back to it as I would render it in the beloved Mary Hughes Standard Translation. That goes, in the same way that atoms, which are too small to be seen by the naked eye, make all physical things visible, so faith makes all spiritual things visible. See, we can't see atoms with our naked eye. That which is visible was made up of things that are not visible. And we can't see atoms with our naked eye, but neither can we see faith. You can't see faith. It is ethereal in that sense. All we can see is the results. We can see the results of atoms. You put a bunch of atoms together, and then you can see the atoms. You put faith in action, and then you can see spiritual things. They're only viewed when we see the results. Now, before I make this next statement, I want you to understand that I believe in original sin. I believe that we were all born with a sin nature, okay? I agree with David when he wrote in Psalm 51, verse 5, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." We are all born with a sin nature. Okay? I believe that very much. I think that's a very foundational understanding of what sin is that we are born with a sin nature. But having said that, I think faith is something that has to be unlearned. Let me explain to you what I mean. Not only are we born with a sin nature, but as we are created in the image of God, we are also born, as Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we are born with eternity in our hearts. We all have this longing for God. We have this, there's something within us that wants to reach out and grab a hold of Him. It is something that we long for. And I think that we have very much of our natural DNA weavings, this desire to have faith in that which we can't see. It's God-given. You don't have to teach a 3-year-old kid to believe in God. You have to teach a 3-year-old kid not to believe in God. And I think faith is unlearned through our culture, through our society. The world is very involved today, very stridently involved in trying to unlearn this thing that we have within us called faith. Verse 4 says, "By faith Abel offered to God a more sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, being dead, he still speaks." You know, Cain said, this is implied through the text, but Cain said to God, "Okay, God, I'll serve you. I'll bring my sacrifice. Abel came and offered his sacrifice. Well, I'll offer a sacrifice too. I will serve you, God, but I'm going to do it on my terms." And in that regard, virtually, that's the human condition. That's the way almost everybody starts off. You know, we always want God to jump through our hoops. We want God to serve us in the manner that we think that He should. And when we set ourselves up as Lord, when we do that, then we end up justifying all our actions. And our faith suffers the same fate as Abel's. Another really smart guy by the name of Augustine, he lived in the 4th century, a long time ago, but he said this: "If you believe what you like in the gospel and reject what you don't like, it's not the gospel you believe, but yourself." See, oftentimes it's not a lack of faith that's the issue. That's not the problem. You know, we're kind of like the Father in the Gospels where it says, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." But it's not really our lack of faith that's the issue. It's the object of our faith. It's not whether we believe. It's just in whom or what we believe. We are people of faith. We put our faith into action a lot. And you know, but it's the object of it that's the issue. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he didn't see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. You know, he walked with God for more than 365 years. And I always had, growing up, I think when I hear this story in Sunday school, I had this picture of, well, back in those days, back in the olden times, that they had this more like a physical kind of relationship with God, and God would actually come down and knock on his door, and they would go walking together, you know, and that it was a very salient kind of thing, you know, kind of a sensate sort of relationship with God. But it says here in chapter 11 of Hebrews that it was by faith Abel walked with God. For 365 years, by faith, Abel walked with God. His ability to walk with God wasn't any greater than our ability to walk with God. He had the same faith walk that you and I have, and yet his lasted for almost 4 centuries. And then he says in verse 6, "But without faith, it's impossible to please him. Because if anyone wants to come to God," he says, "that he must first believe who he is, or that he is, and then believe that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." Enoch's walk was the same as our walk. It was a faith walk. And the faith walk, pleasing God, is twofold. It comprises of 2 things. First thing, If we want to have a faith walk with God, the first thing, we got to believe that He is. That's what Hebrews 11:6 says, isn't it? And the second thing is that He's a God who's involved in our lives, that He's a rewarder of those that diligently seek Him. But we don't seek Him on our terms, we seek Him on His terms. I actually had a guy come into the office a few weeks ago, and he said we'd had some encounter that our paths had crossed a couple of years ago, and I didn't really remember it, but I'd helped him out when he was asking for some help, and I bought him some gas and stuff. And since then he'd been studying and reading, and he said, I look at all this evidence for God, but I want you to prove to me that God exists. And I said, what do you mean? I said, I want proof. I want to have a miracle happen right in front of me. I want somehow for God to just undeniably prove Himself to me. And after we talked for about 15 minutes, I told the guy, I said, you know what? He's not going to do that. He told me that some friend told him that if you just hang on, that someday God would. And I said, I don't think God's going to do that. I don't think God is going to prove Himself to you, because if you're not willing to take what He's already given you, He's not going to give you anything more. And he said, didn't know what I meant. And I said, you're trying to get God to come to you on your terms. And not until you want to receive God on His terms, you believe that He is, and that He's a rewarder of those that diligently seek Him, will He reward you. And he kind of got up and walked out with that. Soren Kierkegaard was the darling of the neo-orthodoxy of the 19th century. Not exactly what we would call the poster child for conservatism, okay? But he said this: it is so hard to believe because it is so hard to obey. You understand what he's saying with that? It's so hard to believe because it's so hard to obey. In other words, because we don't want to obey, we don't believe. It's so hard for us to surrender our will to His. It's easier for us to say, God, you come to me on your terms, than it is for us to say, God, I'll come to you on your terms. And since we're not willing to do that, we don't believe. And then he also said, life is understood backwards, but it is lived forwards. He's saying that we live our lives going from here to there. We live our lives going forwards. And as we look ahead at the future, we see the unknown. We see what hasn't happened yet, and we say, I don't understand. Life is lived forwards, but it's understood backwards. But if we turn around and look where we've come, and we see how the pieces fit together, and we see God in action retrospectively, then we go, okay, yeah, now I see. And I think that if we do that and see how faithful God is in the past, then we can go forward into the unknown with the same confidence that looking back gives us. And I think this is what C.S. Lewis had in mind when he wrote, another smart guy. We're going to be quoting a lot of smart guys today. A man can accept what Christ has done without knowing how it works. Indeed, Lewis says, he certainly won't know how it works until he's accepted it. There's something I think that is definitely wrong with the picture that has people who don't believe, or that don't have faith. They don't believe in God, and yet, because they don't have a life that walks with God, they don't do as Enoch did. They want to have God come to them on their terms, and when He doesn't, then they lack the faith. And there's something wrong with the people, with the person that says, I don't want to walk in obedience to God. I don't believe in God. And yet then when something goes wrong, they want to blame Him for the things that go wrong in life. Just because God doesn't jump through the hoops or doesn't act the way that anybody thinks that He should. Faith is not. Let's look at some other things that faith is not. We don't have faith in faith. And that's one of the things that you'll hear on TV a lot. The guys that you'll come up on TV, they'll tell you that you have to have faith in faith. You have to have the same kind of faith that God has. Let me explain something. God does not have faith. God has power. God is all powerful. He doesn't have to believe something's going to happen. He says it and it happens. The Bible doesn't tell us to have faith like God, nor does the Bible tell us to have faith in faith. That would be idolatry. It's not faith in our own abilities. like the little engine that thought it could. It's not that. It's not the sort of thing that if we just try really, really hard and well, God gave me these 2 arms and He gave me these 2 feet and I'm just going to go up and get her done. That's not what faith is. We have faith sometimes in our own abilities. And then when we fail, we think God has failed us. It's not faith in our own abilities, and it's not faith in stuff. The Old Testament has a lot to say about people, well, Jesus too, about people that would trust in their riches. And Solomon said, if you're a rich man, then you spend all your time and energy getting rich, then you have to spend all your time and energy trying to protect what you got. And it's not faith in our stuff. We don't find our security in the things that we can accumulate and hoard. It's not faith in each other. And I see this a lot of times in marriage, that one of the member of the marriage union will look to the other one as their source, and they want to have their faith is placed in another human being, and when that human being fails, then so does their trust in God. No, it's not faith in any of those things. It's simply and solely and only faith in Jesus. That's what the Bible tells us, that we have faith in Jesus, period. And when we try to do anything else, we're sure to be let down. Now, the rest of chapter 7, I think, could be outlined by 7 things that God says is a characteristic of a man or a woman of faith. And we'll get through 5 of them today, and the other 2 we'll have to save for next week. But a man of faith is, and please excuse my politically incorrect use of the male gender. But a man of faith is, first of all, someone who's moved by his faith. A man of faith is also somebody who walks in obedience, verses 13 to 16, or 10 to 12, I'm sorry. It'd be 8 and 9. That's what, 8 and 9, not 8 and 10. I think Christian must have done these PowerPoints. It'd be 8 and 9. It's one who accepts his or her own humanity, verses 11 and 12. It's someone who has an eternal focus, verses 13 to 16. And then number 5 is one who grows in his or her faith, 17 to 19. And the next week we'll get to, it's one who knows that sin's satisfaction is only temporary. And lastly, one who doesn't give up. And we're going to examine each one of these as we go through the rest of the book. So first of all, a man or a woman of faith is someone who is moved or is changed by his faith. Verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with a godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. In Noah's life, God said it, and that was all he needed. God said it, and it was settled. God said, Noah, I want you to build me a big boat, because I'm going to make it rain. Noah didn't say, well, what's a boat? Noah didn't say, what's rain? They'd never had rain before. The whole earth was watered by this mist that kind of came up from the ground. There was like a vapor canopy, I think, that surrounded the earth. And there was kind of like a closed hydrocycle. And he says, he didn't say, what's a boat or what's rain? God said, build a boat. And the only question Noah asked, what are the dimensions? And he lived a life that inspired his own sons. His 3 sons got on board with him as they built the ark. In verse 8, a man of faith is one who walks in obedience. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. When God called Abraham when he was in Ur of the Chaldees, he only gave him one step. He said, Abraham, I want you to leave this place and go to where I'm showing you. I want you to get up and leave your family and leave this country. So Abraham left some of his family and went to the edge of the country. uh, he kind of sort of obeyed. It took him several years before he came into full obedience. But oftentimes when God gives us a step, we want to know what's going to come next. We want to know what comes after that. We want to be able to see, well, what's the last step? How do all these pieces fit together? And so often God doesn't give us the second step until we take the first step. Sometimes we want to know what the whole picture is going to look like, just in case we might want to not go there, in case we want to tell God no. In verse 11, a man or a woman of faith accepts his or her own humanity. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. She bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Sarah was 89 years old when they had received the promise that she was going to become pregnant with Isaac. She was 90 years old when she gave birth. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. I mean, they were frail, they were feeble, they were weak, they were past the age, very much past the age of conception. When we read the story, when the angel came and was talking to this 99-year-old Abraham, and this 89-year-old Sarah was in the tent, when the angel of the Lord told Abraham that they were going to have a child within 9 months, she laughed inside the tent. And the angel said, "What are you laughing at?" And she goes, I didn't laugh. And she says, "Yes, you are. Yes, you did. And so when she is born, I want you to name him Isaac," which means laughter. Somewhere in that picture, the author of the Hebrews is telling us, somewhere in that scene where her laughter of incredulity shifted to a laughter of joy. A laughter of, "There's no way, I'm 89, he's 99, to, wow, what a good God we serve. It's a man who accepts his own humanity, or a woman that accepts her own humanity, that realizes that it's not up to my physical ability to get it done, but it's up to God. And then number 4, a man of faith is someone who has an eternal focus. All these, the author tells us, died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off and were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that countries from which they had come out, they would have had an opportunity to return. You know, if they had kept their eyes on Ur, or if they'd kept their eyes on Haran, if they'd kept their eyes on where they had come from, when the going got rough where they were, they would have probably turned back. But instead, even though they had lapses in faith, if you read their story in Genesis, you'll see their time that they stumbled in their faith. But one thing they did not do is take their eyes off of God. And even when they stumbled, they kept their eyes going forward, and they didn't turn back. Verse 16. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared a city for them. See, Abraham, and by inclusion also Sarah, he desired God's will even above his own. And it says that he was not ashamed to call God, or because of that God was not ashamed to call them to be called. God was not ashamed to be called their God. You know, it's kind of like the dad whose son hits the home run in the Little League, and the guy's going up and down all the bleachers going, "That's my boy. I gave birth to that guy." You know, he's not ashamed to be called his daddy. Well, God was not ashamed because Abraham had fixed his eyes on the goal and was willing to learn what the faith walk looked like in every circumstance, was willing to be led by God, didn't stumble because of his weaknesses, but kept his eyes. When he'd fall down, he'd get back up and start going the same direction again. And because of that, God wasn't ashamed to be called his God. When Abraham would walk by faith, God would just tell all the heavenly hosts, "That's my boy. I gave birth to that. That's my son." and he's well pleased in him. By faith, a man of faith is one who grows in his faith, verses 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Now, I've heard the guys on TV talk about how faith is a muscle that needs to be exercised. And in a sense, that's true. It's not in the sense of where you just have to keep pumping it and pumping it and pumping it and pumping it until you're Superman, super faith. It's not that. But in a sense, it isn't something that needs to be exercised to grow. And Abraham is a prime example of that. Some of us have never started the journey of the faith walk because we look at what we lack and we see ourselves as being unable. And that was one thing that Abraham never did look at. He never did look at his lack. He always looked at God's provision. God called Abraham when he was in this place, the hometown of paganism in Ur of the Chaldees, when he was 75 years old. He was 75 years old. Isaac wasn't born for 25 years later. There was that whole debacle with Ishmael and Hagar, and then God kind of lined him out on that. And then when Abraham was 100 years old, he gave birth to Isaac. And Isaac, we always picture him as being this little boy, when you were in Sunday school and they gave you the little handouts that you got to color in when Isaac was taken up on top of Mount Moriah. And we always picture this little 5 or 6 year old boy. Isaac was between 15 or 20 years old, 15 to 30 years old. We don't know exactly when it was, but he was a young man. Abraham would have been somewhere between 115 and 130 at that time. And it was somewhere between 40 and 65 years that Abraham waited before God had brought him to that place where he said, I want you to offer up your only son, your only beloved son. If God had asked Abraham to do that when he was 75, we probably have a different picture in the scriptures. If God had asked him to do that when he was 85, probably wouldn't happen that way. If God would have asked Abraham to do that even when he was 100, when he believed that God was going to make his loins alive for one more great finale, I'm not sure that Abraham would have trusted him in that. But it took 40 to 65 years of God showing his faithfulness over and over and over again to where when God said, I want you to take your son, your only son, whom you love, and I want you to take him up on this mountain and sacrifice him. And Abraham says in the text, got up early the next morning and saddled his donkey and went to the place where is now today is known as the Temple Mount. God didn't ask him to do something that God hadn't prepared Abraham to be able to do. As God was preparing Abraham and growing him up step by step by step by step, he brought him to that place where he was able, and today, we look at the story of Abraham, and he had much more failings than he had successes. And yet today we call him Father Abraham, the father of the faith. Going back to my BC days, the before Christ days, there's a picture of me back then. I was kind of bumpy then. I also wore mittens a lot. But when I was so eruditely asking those questions about what is faith, where can I get some, where's the faith store? Just as I was thinking, I was being so witty when I would ask these questions of Sherry and subconsciously and then later consciously trying to undermine her faith so that her lifestyle would quit contradicting my lifestyle. And I used to tell God that if he wanted me, he just had to hit me upside the head with a 2x4. And you know what? That's exactly what God did. And, it could be that you've said the same things. That's a guy that I met in my office a couple of weeks ago. That's when I told him this story. And he said, that's what I need. I need the 2x4. And I said, but the problem is, you're describing what the 2x4 is going to look like. You're describing its dimensions. You're describing exactly how it's going to happen and what it's going to accomplish. You're wanting to dictate all of the details of this 2x4 encounter. I was doing the same thing. I did that for many years. And it wasn't until I realized that the 2x4 was my own stubborn will. The faith store was something that was down deep inside of me. That it was something that was put in me at the moment that I was conceived in my mother's womb. That was where the faith store was. I was looking for something outside, looking for something that I could go and do, see, touch, or feel. And the reality is that God had placed that measure of faith within me. And it was my choice whether to go with it or not. And the 2x4 was one of my own design, one of my own making. And it wasn't until I realized that the 2x4 was my own stubborn will of independence. And when I realized that, it came along and knocked my block off. I've never regretted a single moment of it since. You know, I could have remained. I remember that night. It was over 35 years ago, but I remember very well that night. I'll get rid of the headless guy here. I remember that night very well and wondering if I would take that step of faith or not. I was scared to death to do it. I didn't want to step forward because I didn't trust myself. I knew that I was nothing but a failure. I didn't think I could. You guys, I looked at you guys back on November 7th, 1981, and I thought, there's no way I can be one of them. You know, no way I can be one of those goody two-shoe Christian people. And so it was with much temerity when I took the step forward, when I finally surrendered to Him. When I said, okay, God, no longer my terms. I want to do this on your terms. And I was faced with this. I could remain in that same empty, vacuous life, or I could surrender my will to His. And I remember so well that feeling that I had when I did. And I said when I was going home that night, God, I surrender. I'm tired of fighting with you. I was driving home that night all by myself in my truck, and I said, I surrender, Lord. It's your calls from here on out. But I said, I got to be honest with you. I'm scared. I don't think I can do this. I was afraid that I would say yes and then do no. And yet, because I'd done that so many times before, you know, I tried to make changes so many times before. I tried to clean up my act so many times previously, and none of them worked. But I realized that night that I was no longer saying yes to myself and trying to do it myself, but I was saying yes to God. I was surrendering to Him. I said, no longer what I make you out to be, but who you are. No longer trying to dictate the terms. No longer trying to do it in my concept of how it's going to happen. Not trying to do it in my strength, but to do it in His strength. And that was the moment of salvation for me. And it could possibly be the moment of salvation for somebody here this morning, or maybe somebody down the line that's watching the video or listening to the podcast. Or it could maybe be not only a matter of a moment of somebody's salvation, but it could be that there's somebody here that you've gotten stale in your walk, that you've put your eyes on the failures far too often, and you've so often, even in your Christianity, have expected God to answer this and to walk this way and to talk that way, and you've had it kind of dictated how God is going to come through. And it could be that maybe this is a moment where God is calling you back to the place where you take your hands off and surrender them to Him. There's nothing more freeing than that. That's what faith is. If faith is a synonym for trust, then what the walk of faith is, it's the trust walk. It's the one that just says, God, I place this in your hands, and I believe that you will do good because you are good. And if God is speaking that to someone here this morning, I urge you with all that's within me that you would surrender and respond to that as we go to Him in prayer now. God, we do praise your name. You are faithful. You are the faithful and true. God, every man is a liar and you tell the truth. God, the things that we can't comprehend are elementary to you. God, the things that we can't handle are the very things that you want us to surrender to you. And so, God, we come to you with our arms lifted up this morning, lifted up in surrender. And we plead with you, Lord, take over. Show us how to keep our grubby mitts off of it and just let you take us through that wonderful, beautiful, exhilarating faith walk. that we could do as Enoch did, that we could walk with you through all of our days. Accomplish that now, Lord. Do that work in each heart, each soul, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand.